prominent South Asian think tanks as our partners of today's program. These are Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS India, Sustainable Development Policy Institute, Pakistan, Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka, IPS, and South Asia Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment, Southie, Nepal. Before I start the proceedings, let me just announce a few housekeeping rules. Please keep your microphones off at all times, except when you speak. You can write your questions and comments in the chat box, and we will also have a question and answer session when you can make your points. So we have a set of prominent speakers who will reflect on their insights on a very timely issue during a very important time in history when the world is facing the wrath of coronavirus pandemic. Before I invite the speakers, let me give a short background of today's dialogue. The OECD has recently prepared a report titled Multilateral Development Finance 2020. The report highlights that the world needs an effective multilateral development financial system to deliver the promises of the 2030 Agenda and support the recovery of developing countries from the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. And the OECD report has been published yesterday on 26th October 2020. You can download it. Avro will share the link. Today is also the occasion to launch the report in South Asia. So while the report and its focus will be introduced at the dialogue by our OECD colleagues, we have thought of taking the opportunity to explore the issue of multilateral development finance in the context of South Asian countries. We all know that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, there was an estimated financial gap of $2.5 trillion in implementing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. With the COVID-19 pandemic on, the challenges to achieving these SDGs have deepened. Currently, no country in the world is on track to meet all the goals by 2030. South Asian countries will also face massive financial gap, particularly in the areas of infrastructure, both physical and social. Social infrastructure gap was high even before COVID-19 hit these countries, and that was reflected in the poor health management during the COVID pandemic in most of the South Asian countries. During the current COVID-19 crisis, the governments in the region are facing a dual challenge. On the one hand, they have to increase revenue. On the other hand, they have to urgently increase the social spending. However, we know that domestic resource mobilization effort has been lower than expected in these countries. With the outbreak of pandemic, the economies of these South Asian countries are predicted to shrink, and private investment and consumption have been falling, employment has declined, and more importantly, the South Asian countries have 75% or more of their employments in the informal sector. And a narrow domestic resource and a very tight fiscal space have constrained the ability of the governments to fund the development initiatives and improve the quality of social and economic goods in the region. So COVID-19 has posed a challenge not only to how to move forward, but also to protect the achievements which were made during the pre-COVID period. It is feared that many progresses made so far will be undone due to the COVID-led economic hardship. Therefore, a concerted effort is required to protect what we have achieved and to make further progress. The bulk of the required finances will come from the South Asian countries themselves through revenue and savings, but the international finance will also play a very critical role. We know that the prospect of external development finance in the form of foreign direct investment, remittances, overseas development assistance is not very encouraging. And with the current level, the development objectives of developing countries and South Asian countries will not be fulfilled. Therefore, it is crucial that multilateral development finance is increased and the large financial gaps are addressed. Along with this, new sources of private resources will be required. And there are many options, financial tools and approaches such as guarantees, green infrastructure, bonds, etc. Can be explored. But that will be discussed in today's dialogue in great details. So with these few words, I would now begin the proceedings of the dialogue. And we have two keynote presentations to be made by OECD and CPD, and then we have 4 regional commentators. We will then open the floor for open discussion, and then we have a video message, and we will have a special commentator, and then we'll conclude the session by remarks from our chairman, Professor Emma Sopan. So first, let me invite Mr. Oliver Cotena, who is the head of Unit Policy Analysis and Strategy Development Cooperation Directorate at the OECD. So, Oliver, you have about 10 to 12 minutes to make the presentation.
Thanks a lot. And let me try to share my screen. So I hope it works for everyone. Thanks a lot, Dr. Famida, for this introduction, and I will try to already address some of the points you raised, in the presentation. And thank you also, Dr. Deb, for the invitation in the name of the Center for Policy Dialogue. As you know, we are doing this round of discussions around the world. We started yesterday in Europe with a kickoff with our Secretary General, Angel Goya. Today we are in South Asia. Tomorrow we will be in America. The day after we will be back in Europe, and then we'll conclude with Africa. So thanks a lot for joining us on this round of discussion. And just to mention, I have here also with me my 2 colleagues and co-authors, co-lead authors of the report, June Kim and Abdoulaye Fabregas, who are with us also today. So going to the presentation, the main message of the report is that multilateral development finance is on the rise, and we see with the COVID-19 crisis that the case for multilateralism has been made even stronger. With global problems, we need global solutions. Our report, as usual with OECD report, focuses on evidence and statistics, and we see that multilateral finance is growing in importance as a channel of development cooperation. On the left-hand side, you can see the growth of multilateral development finance that has been faster than bilateral finance. And then it reached, $72 billion in 2008 at a peak, represented 42% of official development assistance. On the right-hand side, you see who are the main benefactors, and that won't surprise you. This is mainly the UN system and the World Bank Group. However, we see, and we'll come back to that in recent years, there are new vertical funds, new MDBs, that have appeared and that also compete for the funding. This growth, is driven essentially by a surge in earmarked funding. And for those who are not familiar with this term, that means when the donors ask the multilateral organization to spend the money on a specific project, on a specific country or a specific problematic. And we'll see that this is what has triggered the growth of the multilateral system with an increase in 50%, over the past 10 years of this earmarked funding. And this was not, as we often think, done to the detriment of core funding, what goes to the general budget of the organization, but to the detriment of bilateral funding, which means that the donors do more and more through the multilateral and less, directly. We explain also this growth, by the increase in the number of contributors. And at OECD, we are working with the Development Assistance Committee that represents the largest donors. But we see on the right hand side of the slide that now 1/3 of the top contributors to the multilateral system are non-DAC members, representing 1/4 of the funding. And in particular, I wanted to draw your attention to the number 6 among those contributors, that is the private sector, with the philanthropy and so on, that has gained in importance in recent years. Why multilateral organizations? Also because they appear to be more effective than the bilateral donors. And when we looked, through our global partnership for effective development cooperation, we monitor a number of indexes in terms of effectiveness, and we see that the multilaterals perform better on all accounts except one, that is annual predictability. And again, this is linked to the funding and to the behaviors of their shareholders. So it's not necessarily, the fault of the multilateral organizations themselves. On the right-hand side, we see also that donors go to multilateral organizations for specific comparative advantages. For instance, on the top, you see scale. If you want scale, you go to the World Bank or other MDBs. If you want support for fragile context, you go either, to the UN or the World Bank, and so on. So this is the good news. That the multilateral is on the rise, but there is also, a downside to it. And the system is, as we have seen during the crisis, the COVID crisis, under stress. The COVID, put pressure on the system to deliver. In the short term, that means stop the bleeding, as we call it. And to answer to what you said, Dr. Famida, we look, for instance, at the drop in FDI and private finance to developing countries, and we expect, this external finance to developing countries to drop by $700 billion this year, 2020 compared to 2019, primarily due to FDI movements. We also, in another report, the Global Outlook on Financing for Sustainable Development that we'll release in a couple of weeks, estimates that the growth in the SDG financing gap that you mentioned will increase by 70% as a result of the crisis. So there is really a need, to act and to be effective. And we look in the report at 3 trends that might affect, the capacity of the multilateral system to respond effectively. The first one, and sorry, it might be a bit hard to read, but it shows that the system is increasingly crowded and fragmented. And on the right-hand side, you see the evolution of the system since 1944 and the Bretton Woods institution until today. And you distinguish 4 different waves of adjustment of the system. The first one is the creation of the UN and the Bretton Woods institution right after the Second World War. The second one is around the 60s, 70s, with the emergence of all the regional agencies in response to the changing geopolitical context. And also you see some specialized agencies and a focus on development that is increasing. The third wave has been from the 1990s onward, where actually you needed to address the failure of the previous ways of globalization, and appeared some specialized agencies, some vertical funds, and that significantly increased the number of institutions in the game. So last wave that just started, in this decade is with the creation of the AIIB and NDB, maybe a new shift in the geopolitical order also, and creation of new institutions. The question then is what will happen with the COVID-19? I mean, will it accelerate, I mean, this trend towards fragmentation, or on the contrary, help consolidation of the system? And as we say with crisis, it's often a Darwinian process, and only those who can adjust, I mean, can survive. So we'll see what that means for the multilateral system. The second trend we have here is that the system is increasingly becoming an a la carte system. And we are moving from a deep integration that was consensus-based to something that is a la carte and coalition-based. And this is on this graph measured with the share of core funding, I mean, to those institutions compared to the share of earmarked funding. And we see that the share of core funding is been declining over time and continues to do so. As a result of that, and I'm glad we have also a colleague from WHO here, what we have tried to do is to map the different organizations against vulnerability, looking at their dependence on earmarked funding and on a limited number of donors. And we see that they are on the right-hand quadrant, top right-hand quadrant, that some institutions are at risk. I mean, one that was the most debated during the COVID crisis was the WHO, with the threat of the US to stop the funding. And the result of that, if it happened, will be that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation would become the main funder of the WHO. So it will be a private institution that will be the top contributor to an international organization. The third trend we look at is that actually this steady increase in the multilateral finance, I mean, hides some disparities and shift towards a relatively less concessionality of outflows, which is, we'll see, very important for the low-income countries and the LDCs. On the left-hand side, we see, I mean, as was mentioned before, for the inflows here, looking at outflows, again, that the MDBs and the World Bank are the largest one in the game. And on the right-hand side, we see that while concessional funding has remained stable over the last decade, non-concessional has grown much faster. This shift, I mean, has been to the benefit mainly of middle-income countries and even UMICs, upper middle-income countries, and to the detriment of low-income countries and LDCs. I mean, this is logical. I mean, because that's those who can afford, I mean, the largest infrastructure project and so on. And also, I mean, we must say there is also a bias, I mean, in this graph, because when countries graduate, I mean, they move from one category to the other one, and the less LDCs, I mean, the less funding obviously goes there. And a last point, I mean, is also that this shift also affects the distribution of spending across SDGs. That's something, some data we have compiled using our own algorithm, I mean, on the SDG financing lab that is available online. And we see that most of the money goes to SDG 7, 8, 9, and 11. No surprise, I mean, that's where the infrastructure is. And in terms of COVID, I mean, many people point at the loss of biodiversity as one of the causes of the pandemic. And as you can see, what I find interesting around the SDGs 14, 15, I mean, life below water, life on land, you see that those are the least funded among all SDGs. So now to conclude, is the COVID crisis, I mean, a good time for multilateral innovation? I mean, should we take this opportunity to reform the system? And since everybody is talking about build back better, should we also apply it to the system and the channels of transmissions of aid? We don't have the data yet because, of course, there is in our CRS system a 1 year at least gap in the data. But we know, because the MDBs and others have kept track of their funding, that they spent in immediate relief response to COVID over $250 billion, compared to only $5.5 billion by the bilateral donors. But here we nonetheless run a survey with our members and ask them, how did you think the multilateral system performed in responding to the crisis? And the responses are overwhelmingly, positive, and in particular, pointing at the capacity of the multilateral system to share the knowledge, to provide immediate financial assistance. Because they can disburse more quickly. They can help governments and so on. The only point, and that was one of your points in your introduction, Dr. Famida, was on the social protection, actually, that they think that they did not perform so well. And there has already been proposals, I know, from France, to create a new vertical fund, to address this issue. Then our survey also points, however, at some limitations of the system. And what I find very interesting in looking at the answers is actually that the first limitations they point at, which is the lack of financial resources and the lack of coordination among shareholders, are exogenous to the multilateral organizations. That's how the donors behave when they channel their money through the system. So that's why in the report, and I won't go in the details, for the sake of time, we suggest a number of areas for reform. But the only thing I want to say here is that we stress the fact it needs to be all the system that needs to be reformed, not only looking at what the multilateral organization should do, but also what the donors should do as shareholders of the multilateral system. And with that, I give you back the floor and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Olivia Canetta, for your very succinct presentation. The report is very large. I know it's about 128 pages, probably. But you have managed your presentation within 15 minutes or so. So I wouldn't repeat what you have said. I'll just move on to the next presentation, which will be made by Dr. Devapriya Bhattacharya, Distinguished Fellow, CPD, and former Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Bangladesh to the WTO and UN offices in Geneva. Over to you.
Thank you, Executive Director. Thank you, Famida. Agra, will you put on my PowerPoint and let me, in between, compliment my colleagues in Paris, Olivier, Abdoulaye, and June, for a fantastic work you have done and for the friendship and partnership which we are having today with all the South Asian colleagues over here. So let me go to my first slide and tell you that I know these colleagues very well and have been interacting with them off and on with their own work and also our work on the Southern Voice. So always look forward to their new outputs. So this is a substantive and a relevant report, as you have just heard from Olivier, both in terms of framework and also the content, context, content, all this. And if you look at the report, that they frame it around three broad sets of issues. One is the overview of the system, the other is on the funding, and the other is on the financing. So they have, where do they get the money and how do they spend? So these are the, I think, the three issues over there. And of course, they end up with a set of, reform issues at the end, the 3 building blocks and 6 pillars over there. So I read it with great interest. And my only, wish is that there was a 4th chapter. The 4th chapter on development effectiveness of the multilateral system. Some of the effectiveness issues have been embedded in the funding and in the financing issues, and also in the last slides on the reforms. But it would have been good to get into the ongoing debate on development effectiveness, how to define it, and what are the new challenges put to it because of the COVID, apart from the other inherited structural problems within the system, which essentially is also overshadowed by the crisis in the multilateralism as such, not only in the system, but they have this umbrella shadow over them. So that's always there in the future, I think. And my good colleague Shochin will be, I hope, will be also reflecting on some of these global dimensions over there. So let me move on and tell you how do let me interpret some of the conclusions which have been made, whether it is a la carte issue, or it is the vulnerability issue, or the less concessionality issue, or whether the allocation to middle income countries, which middle income countries, and also the effect on SDG financing, and of course, last but not least, the COVID issue. So let me go to Bangladesh and illustrate some of these conclusions, whether they get validated or they get challenged in certain ways. Obro, please move. So if you just a general point on how dependent is Bangladesh as a country, and in which way other colleagues from South Asia will tell that Bangladesh this year got the record volume of foreign aid. It had never happened before, $7 billion. So it came on a COVID year. Whether it is an aberration or it is really an ongoing trend, that is something to be explored, because last year it was $6 billion, this year it's $7 billion. But the fact remains, the foreign aid dependence is less than 2% of the GDP. We earn much more from revenue from export, 15%, or from remittance income, 6% of the GDP. But what is to be noted, that this aggregate low dependence should not obfuscate our high dependence on foreign aid when it comes to health and education, or it comes to transport and communication. So sectoral dependence is much higher, and almost 1/3 of the development program is financed by the foreign aid. So it may sound 2% less, but it is not so less in real terms when it comes to real financing of the development. Please move. So if you see that one of the points is the concessional finance, whether they're decreasing. The Bangladesh case is a classic example of that. 2/3 comes from concessional fund, but it is decreasing. And the rest are form of other official flow, which is concessional, but not so concessional. So ODA is 2/3 and it is decreasing. But if you look at within the ODA, grant is only 4%. So it is as low as 4%. It's 96% is loan, concessional loans, but loans. And the DAC share in the ODA is less than 50%. There was a time it was more than 50% DAC contribution, but it is now less than 50%. And if you look at the general sources, then it is equally split between multilateral and bilateral, but the multilateral is increasing. So this is a validation of ODA position from a country perspective, that the multilaterals are becoming more and more dominant as it goes. The increase in the bilateral, whatever we see at the margin, is not because of DAC, but because of the southern providers. It is the share of the protection of the bilateral is done thanks to the bilateral providers, China in particular, but India, Brazil, and others are also there in certain ways, both multilateral bilateral, southern multilaterals and southern bilaterals in both cases. Please move. So if you look at the sectoral composition, that in this foreign aid, I was mentioning about the structural dependence of the foreign aid in Bangladesh, the development. So 40% each in two sectors. A multi-sectoral approach is 8%. Olivier possibly have it in the report that specialization and multi-sectors are done more by the multilaterals in certain ways. Is it that the finding, or the bilaterals do the multilateral finding? Olivier?
It's the other way around. I think one of the weaknesses of the multilateral is this multi-sector, actually. When you look in the spider graphs that I've showed, you see that the main weakness is actually for this
lack of multilaterals, multi-sectoral. So you see the multi-sectoral here is also, it's a validation of what you have said. It's 8% only in that way. And this is a growing share in Bangladesh, 8% on the Rohingya support, the humanitarian support. For the last 2 years, it has become prominent. What is important for us to note is that Bangladesh has a comfortable debt stock, which is 38%. And per capita is also, debt is lower than any low income country or middle income country. But what is important that it's and so debt servicing liability is only 6.5% of goods and services and primary income. But what is important that our debt servicing liability is increasing from 2015. This is the the other side of the coin, that when the non-concessional aid decreases and you go to more loans, and also from, in some cases, hard-term loans and suppliers credit, and sometimes from southern providers as well, where grants are not necessarily readily available. So this has an implication on your debt sustainability issue. But still, we are still in a manageable sense. Please move. So let me now come to the COVID context. So in view of the COVID flow, I have done a less than full listing. Data is a major challenge, and I will explain it to you. That if you get it after 1 year, for us, we have a living history here, so we want to have access to ready data. So that is a challenge. But there are a number of international data sources, World Bank, IMF, OCHA in UN, and others. We have scavenged through that, and also the open sources. And I have a list of now $4 billion of worth, which is not a matter of joke. For $4 billion of worth, which is almost 1%, if not more, of GDP, foreign aid flow and this is all fresh money. This is all fresh money. So it is from March to end of third week of October. This is the time period I'm putting up here. 90% of this money came from multilateral institutions. You see, this is the dominance of the multilateral institution. And if you think that the UN system is also multilateral, then you have 92.4%. The bilaterals are less than 10%, 7.8%. But I must alert you that the UN system and the may be on the low side, and bilaterals are definitely on the low side because it does not include the repurposed money. Where a lot of repurposing has happened within the existing projects. But again, one can debate this is not fresh money. So that is a analytical issue, that whether we include that money or repurpose money or we don't, because it has own trade-off, because this has its opportunity cost from taking away from an existing project and putting it over there. So bilateral channel, on the other hand, bilaterals are underestimated because UN system is also funded by the bilaterals, specifically on the COVID. So we should not chastise the bilateral too much, because they have played their role also to the UN system in certain ways. Please move. So this is a sample picture which you will see. Then I tried to classify them under 3 heads. My 3 heads are, one is direct emergency support, health related, other is sectoral support, but with COVID alignment, and the third is budgetary support. Now, Bangladesh is a lucky country. 46% of the total flow of this $4 billion budget support, 39.5%, and 14.5% only COVID emergency in that. So I leave it for discussion whether it's good or bad. But from the country point of view, the government's point of view, this is fantastic. Because the more money you get as budget support, the better is easier for flexibility and fungibility. So the fiscal space is improved. The government can, enjoy the freedom of allocating the money. So in that sense, I don't know about other countries how much budget support they have got, but almost half of the money which came to coming to Bangladesh is almost 46% budget support. And on the sectoral support, what we see, the old projects had been adapted to COVID now. So even if it is digital, performance issue or a physical road issue, so we have all add-on component of on COVID, and then that is how it has been done. Let's move on. So what you see that among them, who are the topmost providers now? All of them are multilaterals. On the top of the game is, of course, World Bank, 36%, followed by IMF. IMF has resurrected itself in its rationale in the low-income countries or the middle-income countries with almost 20%, 18.9%. And the Regional Development Bank, if you take, I can talk about it from direct knowledge from Africa and Latin America, they have played a great role in the COVID situation. So within the multilateral, the most promising role which we have seen is the regional banks in certain ways, Asian Development Bank in particular in the context of Bangladesh. And if you now bring in the new kid in the block, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Shanghai one. So you will see it has also come out with support significantly very fast. Bangladesh has already recipient of 2 of the support from Asian Investment in Infrastructure Bank. European Union as also a part of the multilateral system, 10%. So budget support came from all the important multilateral, IMF, ADB, AIIB. So the new southern kid in the block is also giving budget support, and World Bank on that. What we do not have is specific information on the vertical funds. We also do not have specific information on private philanthropy. This is a significant gap in our accounting system. I think this is also shows up in the OECD report. As much as they talk about the multilateral traditionals, they do not talk about so much about the vertical and the non-government, although the non-government private providers are the number 4 in the chart I see. And what we did not, interesting new things are happening. I don't have time for this. Famida is going to make me mute soon. The issue is that you see bilaterals giving project aid. You know, there was a time DFID used to do that. They have closed. Japan has come out as one of the most, the wise benefactors for Bangladesh, and they have put in budget support as a bilateral budget support, which is quite good. And you have seen Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank putting in budget support. And we have also seen what is new thing is the multilaterals are giving matching grants. Because there was a time only multilaterals talked about loans. They have this time come around with small grants to expedite the COVID process in certain ways. I could go on details, but some of them had been based on the traditional windows. IMF and others have created new windows. There is a matters of details some other time and not may be of interest at this meeting. Please move on. Let me close my. So let me now relate it to the framework of policies which we have in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is currently getting into a 8th 5-year plan program. And in this case, the projection, the macro framework, if you look at it, so we see the external resources will be 12.6% of the total outlay for 5 years. And 54% of this total outlay is supposed to come from foreign aid, development finance, through the public sector. So half of the external resources which Bangladesh expects in the coming 5 years is more than half should come from the development finance, and obviously it will be the multilateral organization. Net external borrowing, if you look at it, it will be if you look at the budget deficit which has been planned, or 40%, 47% of it would be financed by this external borrowing. So external borrowing will continue to play important role in Bangladesh fiscal framework and development activities, notwithstanding the fact there is an aggregate low dependence on 2% of the GDP. So one should not really misunderstand the current situation or misinterpret the current situation. It has, and the projection is almost $10 billion per year for the next 5 years. So this year we got $7 billion. So if you look at the policy framers, they are expecting that it is going to go up significantly in the coming years, one after another. And so the 8th 5-year plan is more ambitious. I could have discussed the macro frame here a bit more, but I want to say that foreign aid and multilateral fund will remain important in case of Bangladesh for the coming years. Let me conclude by my general propositions over here. What do I see in the in perspective for the future? Please, next slide. So the 3 major challenges for external finance for Bangladesh. One is financing the COVID recovery. The other is the compensatory concessional finance as it moves out from the LDC group. And it has already moved out from the low income group to the middle income, low middle income countries. Olivier, you are saying money going to middle income country. I hope that is a good news for a country for Bangladesh, which is leaving LDCs becoming low middle income countries and other things. And third is the shortfall on SDG financing. So these are the 3 major external resource demand. What do I suggest over here on Expo policy management? Improve choices of external finance. This is why I am talking about development effectiveness. For same project, you may have 2 different sources of financing. What are your yardstick of choosing A over B or B over C? This is a critical issue for the country at this moment when we look at the choices of finance. Second is debt sustainability issue. This gung-ho borrowing, whether it is budget support or other things, it is going to put more debt pressure on our country, and it is going, and we don't have data. So without those data and doing the real-time management, it is difficult, and national policy and development cooperation. And for the OECD reports, which when I mentioned that I wanted to, the last slide is here, what I wanted to see much more in the future, upload the last slide, please. That the first and foremost is that I want to see a move from this, what you call a la carte multilateralism, which is essentially dominated by UK, USA, Germany, France, or others, or now private sector. I want to see what has been said in the 75th anniversary of the UN, inclusive and integrated multilateralism. Integrated and inclusive multilateralism, and what would that mean? We need to make adequate space for new providers, the southern providers, the private philanthropy, the impact investors. We need to make space for the new instruments, blended fund, blended finance, sovereign wealth fund. We'll have to create a political economy which allows the recipient countries to go for collective action, for a better political, bargaining position and more harmonization, alignment, and accountability. Well, these are all GPEDC principles. And most importantly, to embed development effectiveness in the transactions, that it does not come as an afterthought, but it comes as an a priori filtering mechanism when we access the funds, as I was mentioning. And last but not the least is the new financial instruments have to be thought of. That is the innovative financing which we're talking about. So there is a lot to be done in the coming months, if not years. And I hope and pray that OECD's report will give us the necessary intellectual backup. And my colleagues who are going to speak from various countries in South Asia are also going to highlight some of those issues, and we can work together. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank both the presenters for making their points so clear on an issue which is quite vast, as we can understand from the presentation. The first presentation made was focused on presenting the trends of a multilateral development system and how it evolved, and what is the trend of inflows and outflows, and also the reform measures they have suggested and how to build back better. They have come up with 6 blocks there, building blocks. And the second presentation, which is mostly made in the context of Bangladesh, but also made a number of suggestions which are equally relevant for the other developing countries and South Asian countries. Now we have a set of very eminent speakers from our South Asian think tanks. Let me begin with Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, who is the Director General of Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS in India. So Sachin, you have 5 minutes to, you can focus on either India, or you can also give an overview at the from the global perspective of the multilateral development system and the resource flows in the context of the critical situation that we are facing right now. So Dr. Sachin, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Fahmida. At the outset, I must thank CPD for getting all of us together. I must congratulate you for this dynamic and responsive leadership in South Asia. I must also congratulate Debuda for excellent commentary on the OECD report, and thank Oliver for the presentation and joining us, the South Asian network here. We call it as SASEPS, Oliver, if you want to note, and I'm sure Professor Rahman Subhan would reflect on what SASEPS is all about. So thanks Fahmida, thanks CPD for the leadership. I would definitely like to, in whatever time I have, I would just like to quickly cover a couple of points. First and foremost is that the foreign direct investment is declining, and in the first 6 months we have seen already almost 50% decline in the FDI flows, and this has gone down in the first quarter almost by $399 billion. So this fall in FDI and alternative sources of investment and resources for the South, I think it has dried out. So this is my point number one. Point number two is in terms of multilateralism. the role of multilateral institutions, I think, is important to be delineated in terms of the various focus and active areas of concern that the multilateral institutions bring on table. So that, I think, is extremely important in terms of how COVID-19 is responded to. For instance, India and South Africa came together to moot a proposal at WTO on intellectual property rights to free the COVID vaccine and other advances within COVID-19 armory that we need at the global level in public health realm should be free from intellectual property rights, and access to medicine should be moved forward. So how multilateral institutions, particularly in the trade domain, WTO, etc., are moving forward, that is equally important. I would definitely like to congratulate OECD for thinking of the 4 pillars that they have thought of development finance: the UN development system, the MDBs, the vertical funds, but as Debuda rightly pointed out, we are not clear what all is coming in on that front. And fourth is, of course, the IMF and the EU. Here, the important issue is that when multilateral systems are constituting only around 42% of development finance, the disruptions that we are seeing in global and the regional economy is huge. The production networks, the ecosystem that we require, the regional and sub-regional value chains that we need, they all have gone into disarray. And this calls in for national absorptive capacity. So whatever multilateral institutions are providing may not be the right solution. What probably is important here is the possibility of the national governments to come up with specific dimensions. And here I would just take 2 seconds to mention that in India, we have established what we are calling as the emergency fund, where the multilateral institutions are being encouraged to contribute and let the national decision-making process, particularly the priority setting for multilateral financing, is being addressed. So, for instance, to India's fund, ADB has contributed $1.5 billion under its active response and expenditure support, CARES, as it is being called. And similarly, the World Bank has also contributed $1.5 billion under India's healthcare system tackling system, along with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So if you see, India's assistance to fellow developing countries has crossed $6 billion this year, and incoming multilateral and bilateral has reached almost $11 billion. We are very keenly following the rise of Bangladesh, and I'm very glad to hear from Debuda the rise of incoming resources in Bangladesh. So Indian media is full with the rise of Bangladesh and the lessons that India can have. And I think for very long, Professor Rahman Subhan has been talking about the value chains, cross-border investment, and the value chains across the South Asian countries for better integration. And I think post-pandemic gives us that kind of possibility. In fact, Dr. Fahmida was right in the beginning. She raised the point of social protection, and that's where more attention is required, more focus is required, as within India, we have gone through huge reverse migration, and this has posed several challenges to the industrial restructuring that we need, the revival that we need. This brings me to the point of the G20, and G20 has, in the Saudi-led presidency, has set the ball rolling in terms of how that sustainability issue is raised that Debuda very rightly mentioned. I think the governance through the Paris Club and bringing forward the idea of a coherence across debt for developing countries is nothing new. We have been talking about it, but post-pandemic, as several research reports are showing, the likely number of countries is all set to cross the figure of 42, the countries that would collapse under debt crisis. So this, I think, is a grim reminder to us of the situation that is unfolding. And that's where the role of regional cooperation is extremely important. There are multilaterals whose role is being discussed, but I think at this point, role of WHO for vaccine development is extremely important. The R&D cooperation among countries, maybe through UNESCO, would be important. As I'm losing the time limit, the last point that I want to mention is in terms of the role for industrial policy, and that's what multilateral finance should bring forward after the Bretton Woods-led financing mechanisms all across. We had lost out on industrial policy, and as a result, a lot of countries have gone through deindustrialization. Post-pandemic, it is all the more pronounced. So I would close by saying that goals 7, 8, and 9 of SDGs are important, but role for UNIDO in terms of reviving that industrial policy architecture is extremely important. Debuda, the jury is still out whether the 4th chapter should be on development effectiveness or should it be on the national absorptive capacity. I think we should partner with OECD, but we should not take OECD agenda forward. We should talk about our national institutions and not GPDC priorities. I would close here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, for your valuable remarks. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Abid Qayyum Suleri, who is the Executive Director at Sustainable Development Policy Institute, SDPI, in Islamabad, Pakistan. So, Dr. Suleri, you will, of course, speak about the multilateral development system and in the context of Pakistan, but I would specifically, I'd also like to request you to focus on climate finance in this respect, because it's so important for South Asian countries, and you have some work on this area. So over to you, Dr. Suleri.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Fahmida, comrades from all of South Asia and OECD team. First of all, let me congratulate OECD for doing this very interesting diagnostic work that not only highlights the strengths of multilateral system, but also points out where improvement needs to be made through this very interesting survey. Let me start with the role of multilateral support when it comes to Pakistan's pandemic preparedness and response plan. I would say that most of what government of Pakistan has very effectively done, both in case of smart lockdown, in case of social protection, and in case of health preparedness, it was due to the timely provision of multilateral funding. Just to give you a few numbers, we were the multilateral and bilateral partners. They will be providing $4.4 billion to Pakistan over the next 15 months to finance our disaster preparedness and risk reduction plan, out of which IMF has already provided $1.38 billion through its Rapid Finance Instrument facility, while the World Bank, Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, and Asian Development Bank, they have also signed $1.5 billion agreements. In Pakistan, we have this National Command and Operations Center, NCOC, that is the central focal body for this pandemic response. So although most of these multilateral development agencies, they are coming through EAD, our Economic Affairs Division, but the demand is raised and then managed through NCOC. Apart from these two commitments by IMF and by AIDB and World Bank, Asian Development Bank is also providing $500 million worth counter-cyclical support facility and $305 million as emergency assistance lending within this fiscal year. So this would be quite sufficient amount to take the COVID response further. But then there are certain gaps that we are finding with this multilateral development approach. And I'm referring to Pakistan's ongoing IMF Extended Fund Facility Program. So although we received this $1.38 billion as a rapid finance instrument facility, but our ongoing fund facility program, the negotiations, those are sort of suspended, and the talks are in limbo since February 2020 when COVID struck. The release of third installment for that extended fund facility, that is now made provisional to Pakistan taking action on two important steps, but perhaps they are, the time is not right to take those. One is reducing our energy circular debt, which we have to rightly reduce, but in order to do it, we will have to raise our gas and electricity tariffs. And of course, amidst the time of pandemic, government is reluctant for any political backlash. The time is not right to increase energy tariffs. The second is to reduce fiscal deficit, which would translate to expand tax base. Again, thanks to the work that we are doing to get graduated from FATF grey list, Pakistan is very successful in documenting its economy. I think during last 2 years, we have documented much of economy that we couldn't do in last 8 or 10 years. But again, expanding the tax base right now is not the appropriate time, especially when after the 2 months relief, we are again observing increase of COVID cases. So our current COVID cases, the new cases are around 700 to 800 per day. Fortunately, the number of deaths is still low, less than 10 to 12 deaths per day. Each life matters, but compared to other fatality figures in the region, we are playing quite safe. But having said it, I don't think that we'll be able to meet the requirement of IMF to get the third tranche released. And that would somehow create some sort of mistrust between the people of Pakistan, those the decision makers, as well as with this multilateral development agencies. So this is something that needs to be highlighted. Again, Pakistan is thankful to G20 and OECD for the initiative that where Pakistan got benefited from this pause in debt servicing that we got for 1 year for $1.4 billion. This announcement from G20 that this facility is extended for another 6 months, it would be a sigh of relief as Pakistan is facing this pressure on fiscal reserves, mainly due to this lack of foreign direct investment. I would say that our major contributor to fiscal foreign exchange reserves is remittances, which are increasingly. I think it's due to, again, FATF requirement that most of the remittances now they are coming through banking channel, and that is perhaps one of the explanation why we are observing an increased trend of remittances during the last 3 to 4 months. Finally, coming to the two points which were mentioned in the survey, upscaling the existing social protection programs, strengthening them, and mitigating the economic impact. I think if I were to be a respondent and I have to give my opinion, I'll also vote for these two, that multilateral institutions, they have to strengthen the existing social protection system. In case of Pakistan, it's a Benazir income support program. And we also need to focus on mitigating economic impacts of this COVID. And finally, Famida, coming to your point on this climate change green fund, we have been offered a debt swap from World Bank, almost $400 million. I think I can say without any doubt that one of the constraints that we are facing is a lack of capacities within our ministries and within our existing departments to come up with tangible proposals and to come up with tangible plans for this debt swap. So this green funds or the debt swap facility which was offered by World Bank, Pakistan is still not able to utilize it. And I can see the fate of many other facilities if those are offered for green recovery. We will not have sufficient capacities within the public sector, infrastructure and public sector departments to come up with convincing proposals. And I think that is perhaps another area where multilaterals, they should look into it. The flip side of it, that if we don't have our indigenous capacities, we will be again relying on the multilateral for preparing the PC1s for utilizing these funds. And if we would rely blindly on multilateral, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, would be blaming for ADB and World Bank and IMF for their flawed initiatives that we took on their behalf for this debt swap, which would be purely our own fault. So we have to do our homework right. We have to build our capacity for availing any such debt swap opportunities that come our way. And of course, we are one of the beneficiaries of this multilateral system, if I can see in terms of this COVID response. I'll stop here and I'll be more than happy to take your questions and take your feedback on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suleri. So next, I would like to request Dr. Dushni Wirakon, Executive Director at the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka, Colombo. Of course, now it's obvious that Pushpa will be the last speaker, but I'll just give a head on to Pushpa that I would like to hear on Nepal's preparation in the context of LDC graduation and in the context of LDC's requirement when it graduates, and also in the context of COVID-19. So Dushni, over to you now. So you may like to focus on Sri Lankan context and Sri Lanka's requirement and the scenario of multilateral financial contributions, and also the global multilateral systems landscape and how it's been doing. So over to you, Wirakon.
Thank you, Famida. Let me first of all congratulate both Olivier and Deb. I thought I have not had the opportunity to read the report, but that gave a very precise and comprehensive feel for what the report contains. And I also think, CPD is very spot on to have this dialogue looking at the South Asian context. I think that the South Asian countries are at different stages of relationships in terms of multilateral financing options. India is in emerging bilateral donor to many countries in the region. There are low-income countries, and there are countries that are on the verge of graduating to upper middle income, like Sri Lanka. And I think from that context, it was very interesting to listen to what Deb had to say, because in many respects, Sri Lanka's experience with multilateral financing options pre-COVID and during COVID, and what we expect to happen is somewhat different. So in a nutshell, our dependence on multilateral financing is very limited. Over the last decade or so, Sri Lanka has shifted very much to funding from international capital markets, as well as tapping bilateral donors. So our debt profile, and we do have a large foreign debt overhang. Our public debt is 90% of GDP, and 50% of that is made up of foreign debt. And that debt profile has shifted very sharply to non-concessional forms of funding. So it is currently about 60% of our total foreign debt is on non-concessional and commercial terms. It was just 7% in 2007. So very swift change over time. And of that non-concessional funding, though Sri Lanka's narrative is that we are caught up in a Chinese debt trap. The fact is that 40% of that is from international sovereign bonds. So we are heavily indebted to international capital markets. So in the context of COVID-19, Sri Lanka's reliance on development finance, multilateral finance options has been rather limited. We did approach ADB, World Bank, etc., and some amount of unspent funds that had already been committed to Sri Lanka was we were allowed to use those for priority areas, particularly in the health sector. But other than that, there hasn't been much fresh commitments to fight the COVID itself. Sri Lanka did apply to the IMF for the rapid emergency funding, and that is still on hold. And I think that brings us back to a key point related to multilateral financing options. And I think Olivier mentioned that it's much more effective, and I would agree with him on that. But those funding tools are also very cumbersome. And of course, the conditionalities are still there. So the reason why we have not yet signed on to that rapid IMF rapid fund financing option is because of certain conditions that the IMF wants the government to commit to in terms of its medium-term fiscal sustainability options. The other issue I think that Olivier also raised was whether we would see COVID-19 accelerating some of these trends. And in the Sri Lankan context, what I see is that we would continue to rely more on capital markets and bilateral funders as we try to rebuild and recover from the COVID-19 economic fallout. And that's also very clear in what's happened over the last 2-3 months. We have approached India for short-term swap arrangements. We've approached China Development Bank for some loans to be topped up. So the signals are very clear that until sovereign ratings improve to allow us to go back to international capital markets, the government intends to manage its funding through bilateral arrangements without necessarily approaching multilateral funding agencies, if such opportunities come with conditions attached. But I am also very, my final point is, given time constraints, that we really do need to rethink about the entire development finance landscape as South Asian countries come to middle income and upper middle income. Concessionary funding options are narrowing. That means that multilateral funding agencies also must rethink their lending capacities, raise more funds. And I agree with Deb that the regional development banks, for instance, ADB and AIIB, are coming in much more strongly now than they did 3-4 years ago. So there is, in some sense, a move away from the bigger World Bank and the IMF and towards the regional funding agencies in this part of the world. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dushni, for your comments. Now we have the last speaker from this segment, the regional partners of this program. Now I would like to invite Dr. Pushpa Sharma, Executive Director, South Asia Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment, Southie, from Nepal. So Pushpa, over to you.
Thank you, Famida. Thank you to OECD and CPD for organizing this and inviting Southie also to be a partner. It's a very timely event, I think. The report, I got a chance to go through the executive summary only, very briefly. And I think, and how Olivier also put it very comprehensively in the time frame that was given to him today. And I think it's very, the diagnostics that have been presented are really very interesting. And I also would like to congratulate or rather thank Dr. Bhattacharya for that presentation, which in many ways also, I think, resembles our viewpoint from Nepal. I'll come to the LDC graduation thing in a while, but let me just give a very broad picture of the sources of finance that Nepal depends on. Many of you might not be aware that Nepal actually does quite well in terms of mobilizing, its revenue income, which is around 1/5 of its GDP. But the thing is, although we have 1/5 of our revenue income of the total resources coming from revenue income, most of this goes to recurrent expenditure. So most of the capital expenditure that Nepal has to do comes from official development assistance. And within the ODA as well, which is around 5% of Nepal's GDP, which is not a bad number, because compared to like 2% for Bangladesh, this is still a very decent figure. 60% of the ODA is from multilateral sources. So this also shows the importance of multilateral financing for Nepal. But although we have been doing quite well in terms of revenue income, I was looking at the data for the revenue, comparing the revenue from the March of this year until September. That is after we were hit quite hard by COVID and we had a lockdown with the same time period of last year. And that shows that there is a revenue fall of around 30%. So that gives a sense of the pressure that Nepal is going to feel in terms of the resource mobilization. And another major source for Nepal, as well as for Bangladesh, as was also pointed earlier, is remittances. In terms of the ratio, in terms of if you compare the remittances that Nepal receives in terms of GDP, it is much higher. It's around 1/4 of the GDP is from remittances. Although we have not seen decline in remittances so far, for I think, and there are a few hypotheses for why this might have been the case, and that we might be seeing a fall in remittances in the days to come. So that is another hit that Nepal might see in terms of the fall in remittances as well. So this also brings the importance of ODA into the picture. Having said that, I would also wanted to give a picture of how the multilateral, agencies came into providing, although it's not very large, but they came into providing some support in the wake of COVID-19. For example, the World Bank provided $29 million financing agreement just for the COVID response right in April. So we were quite affected from March. In April, it was $29 million. ADB provided a support of $3.3 million in grant and $250 million as concessional loan. That is to improve the public health system, which is actually what we need at the moment. Similarly, IMF has dispersed $214 million to address the COVID-19 pandemic. So these are some of the funds that Nepal has received, specially targeted at addressing the impacts of COVID-19. But since June, the World Bank has also provided $761 million. There have been these agreements to provide $761 million in the different sectors like energy, road, as usual, education, financial sector, which are very important in terms when we look at the issues of recovery post-COVID-19. Therefore, the issue of multilateral funding for Nepal actually cannot be stated more. So these are very, very important issues. This is also because what we have seen in Nepal is that in some cases, when it comes to bilateral funding, there are also some, these are also somewhat politicized, whether we talk of the BRI from China or the MCC funding from the US, these are quite politicized. Of course, we cannot do away with all this, but I think going through the bilateral route might not be a better option than going through the multilateral route. But what I see as one of the issues, and I think this was also very touched upon only in the discussion earlier, is that when you talk about multilateral funding, one of the issues is, I think, the issue of overlaps. For example, if you look at the UN system, as Dr. Deb said, that if we take UN system contribution also as multilateral funding, the different UN agencies that they work on similar issues. So this question of overlap is also something I think that needs to be addressed in the days to come. This is not only about the donor side. If you look at the recipient side, what we see is that, as I said, that most of our capital expenditure that comes from ODA, but the question is about our national absorptive capacity. Whatever Nepal sets aside for capital expenditure is not spent. It's very, very meager. So the question of national absorptive capacity is also very important when you talk about development finance. Now, to respond to what Famida said about LDC graduation, Dr. Deb has written a very nice article for our publication Trade Insight. Unfortunately, we have not been able to publish it yet, although the plan was to publish earlier for various reasons, COVID being one. But we'll be coming out with this publication very soon. And it's done a very good analysis of the LDC graduation issues for 3 South Asian LDCs, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal, in which he very rightly mentions about that Bhutan and Bangladesh are probably well on track to graduate, even in the wake of COVID-19. A little bit of question mark is for Nepal, whether Nepal is, whether Nepal should actually go about graduating. So far, as we hear in the case here, there has not been a question about whether Nepal should go for graduation or not. The government is actually wanting to go for graduation. It has this also mentioned in its development plans about graduating from the LDC group. Now, what does this mean? If you look at the foreign support that Nepal has been receiving, of course, the portion of loan has been increasing over the years from grant, although these are concessional loans. But now, again, as we talk about this double graduation, Nepal has also now become a lower middle income country. Very, very marginally, Nepal has moved up over there. So with LDC graduation, with graduation to lower middle income country, what's going to happen to this concessional financing? So far, Nepal has been able to manage the debt quite well. It's around 1/3 of its GDP. But if after graduation, we are still in a very fragile mode, and the debt servicing goes up, then what are we going to do? So these are some of the issues I think that needs to be discussed, but we don't see these issues so much being discussed at the country level. Currently, yeah, everyone is occupied with COVID-19, and we don't know what, how are we going to be impacted. Of course, the forecast says that Nepal will still be in the positive territory. But if you compare the initial forecast of 7% and now going to below 1%, even the positive remaining in the positive territory doesn't mean anything. In all this context of the graduation, I think there is a need to take these discussions much further. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pushpa. And that was a very good intervention by our regional partners. And we heard about the regional perspectives on the contribution from the multilaterals, what is the composition, what are the sectoral support, and what, on the whole landscape of funding and what more is needed. We have a sense now. And the issues like absorptive capacity of the recipient countries, data limitations to understand the flow of funds, and also lastly, Pushpa has highlighted some of the issues in the context of LDC graduation, that the amount of the share of loan is increasing vis-a-vis grants, and also there is less conversation on the LDC graduation and how the preparation will be taken at the country level. There are more discussions needed. So with this, we'll now open the floor for discussion. We'll have a few questions or comments from the audience. Now, I see a number of also eminent people are in the audience. So I would like to request, I see Professor Mustafizur Rahman, who is the Distinguished Fellow of Center for Policy Dialogue. Mustafiz Bhai, you may start with the intervention at this point in time. Comments or any questions to the panelists.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you, Fahmida. No, first of all, excellent two keynote presentations, and then excellent interventions by our partners. So all of them, thank you so much. I just take up one point which Deb mentioned about the possibility of the debt overhang in view of COVID and the financial flows. So I was interested to know what are the interest rates at which the non-concessional and concessional loans are coming, and what implications it will have on with respect to the debt overhang that that he and also Sachin and others have also are apprehensive about. So I have this question with regards to the interest rate at which these loans are coming, particularly because G20 was talking about a low interest rate, and also some went as far as also debt relief. But I think that there is a need to redirect the discourse in that direction also, because COVID will be leaving a lot of bad footprints even when we come out of this pandemic. So that is the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mustafizur Rahman. We have
Fahmida,
yes.
Mustafiz usually gives such questions for which he knows the answer. You know, this is his style. He knows the answer. He gives that question.
Because he's a professor, so he has to know the answer, and he will mark afterwards. So we also have a number of regional colleagues, and we also have some colleagues from the development organizations in Dhaka, apart from a number of journalists, friends, colleagues here. So any of you want to make a comment or pose a question to the panelists, please do so. I see here Ganga, Dr. Ganga from IPS. Then, yes, a number of them. Then Mashfiq from the British High Commission here. Yes, yeah, and then Moeen from USAID. I also see our own colleague Khondukar Ghulam Muazzam.
Dr. Fahmida, Dr. Mirza Aziz is there?
Yes, I will call Mirza Aziz sir a bit later after this session, after this question and answer. And then, so I just want to, give an opportunity if anyone. So if we don't have any questions, please, I would like to request the panelists and the keynote presenters, if you want to add any point at this point in time. So please do so.
I have one question. This is Sohel Parvez from the Daily Star. Thank you so much for a nice presentation to Devapriyoda and others. It has in fact opened up a lot of issues to us as reporters. One question Devapriyoda mentioned in his presentation, that is about compensatory finance for Bangladesh for its recovery and rebound and recovery from post-COVID situation. I would like to know if you kindly explain the word compensatory so that we can explain to our readers. Then another one I would like to take from Mustafizur Rahman sir, that is yours, if I'm not wrong, he is talking about the possibility of debt overhang and debt relief. The question is to all the panelists and to all the panelists, that is whether
the COVID-19 pandemic has created demands for debt relief for countries like Bangladesh and others. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That's a very important question, particularly the last one. So, Muazzem, would you like to come in? Yes.
Yeah, just I have just a very small question. While I heard Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, Professor Chaturvedi has raised in his last comment is that why not we look into our own sources and why should we actually look into the GPDC's principles? My point is that how these the Southern providers standards could be harmonized with those of the GPDC's standards and what are the major challenges are there? Thank you.
You are opening up the scar and the wound now. Now Sachin and I will go on sparring for the rest.
Everyone will be given 2 minutes each at the most. So yeah. If you can finish even within less time, that's most welcome. So please, who will start now?
Olivia, of course.
Yes, please.
So thank you, Deb, and I think you were saying you were missing a 4th chapter, and I think we just wrote it today with this extremely rich discussion and this perspective from South Asia, extremely valuable. I mean, very important issues were raised. I mean, debt, access to medicines and vaccination, social protection. Also, the question on which we have been working together, Deb, on the transition and how to ensure that when a country graduates, I mean, there is not a sudden drop, I mean, in the funding, or on the other side, as one of the questions mentioned, to ensure that you don't go in a situation of debt distress because you go from non-concessional to more concessionality and so on. That's one example we had, I mean, in our work with Capo Verde, for instance, that after LDC graduation went into this situation. But I just wanted to take one point, I mean, that many of the remarks from the presenters and the questions point is question of access to funds, a difficulty to have the technical capacities to access to certain funds like the green funds, the capacity to use those innovative tools and instruments, the absorption capacity, the capacity to negotiate debt or make, as you put it, Deb, I mean, to improve the choices of external finance. I think this all together, I mean, shows a big need, I mean, to look on the recipient side and how to really build the capacity in this quickly evolving landscape, and that becomes increasingly complex and technical, how to put more effort into building those capacities. And I must say, to give you one example, we do together between OECD and UNDP in the field of tax reform, and with the Tax Inspectors Without Borders, where there is a return of $100 to each dollar spent on the system. So I think it's definitely worth it. We need to see more broadly than just tax and domestic resource mobilization. Look also at external finance and how we could help countries build this pipeline of sustainable projects. I mean, negotiate the right terms with the right people, with the right instruments and so on. And I think that's really something we need to reflect on, how to do a better job, I mean, on that front. Thanks, that's all my side.
Thank you, Olivier. Who's next? Sachin? No. Maybe you can come later.
No, let me come in first. And
yes.
If I may. There are two issues, apart from Sachin's issue of on development effectiveness and other issues, so which we can go on debating in different places. The whole point on development effectiveness was that it is not the development effectiveness which the GPDC talks about. I'm here talking about some kind of making a comparative assessment when you choose one loan over other, one forms of financing over other. And the issue which is coming out through COVID is that it is not only the process through which you choose, but also the impact of that loans which happens on the ground, particularly from the SDG point of view. That is also very important. Quite often, we do not do those studies and we do not do those comparative analysis when alternative forms of financing are available while making choices. Quite often, they're clouded by your geostrategic and geopolitical consideration, if not other issues. So that was my point on that. So there is, with Sachin, I have, along with you, I have no love lost for the GPDC principles, but it is more the context and the content which we are talking about. And very fast on the two issues. On compensatory finance, you know, what is happening is that it is very clear the compensatory finance may come in the form of global public goods. This has become very clear now, that when we are talking about the vaccines and at what price, who will get it, and etc. And we are arguing that this is not a private product, and this is not, should not be hostage to intellectual property right, private intellectual property rights. We are talking about global public goods. And if it is not globally possible in the global public goods, which is freely available, accessible as an universal product, then you will have to finance in certain ways and others to compensate for the purchasing powers of individuals who are not so fortunate. So that is one of the ways. The other ways is that if you look at the blended finance group, what the World Bank uses the terminology, the blended countries. Bangladesh is a blended country, not blended finance, blended country, which means it has graduated to that level because of its low middle income status, that with, along with, you know, IDA credit, you will have to have some kind of other non-concessional fund. But this mix is very much variable, depends on the country, how do you negotiate. So I'm talking about that you have higher dole of higher proportion of concessionality while you negotiate a blended package with World Bank or the ADB or elsewhere. So there are moments where you can negotiate and do those things apart from the others. But the fact of the matter is, if we move forward, this is a receding frontier. You have just heard from Dushni from IPS, which is a country which is aspiring to be a high middle income country, and the whole debt and other accessing finance is private capital market. It is no more the you know, multilateral system, whether concessional or non. This is a totally different ball game. So that is another part. On the debt overhang issue, again, I will bring back to that issue that most of the loans in the country, and the country level capacity is important here, is not subjected to very rigorous scrutiny before it is accessed or negotiated. So we do not have an really structured assessment framework which is built into the process in order to make a choice for this loan or the other loan from the country A or for country B, and where in which cases we use domestic resources to do it other than social protection. So this is the issue over here. If you look at the debt overhang, the moment for Bangladesh is that 2015, because that is the turning point for Bangladesh. If you look at the data, there is no time for me to explain the data over here, but the data will show you that that is the point when we make the high level decision of moving to southern financing, quite often with the non-concessional financing for visible infrastructure projects. And there where we moved out from other forms of financing, concessional financing from multilateral institutions. We are having the projects, but with a huge debt overhang over there. And some cases, there is lack of transparency and lack of reviews and other things over there. That's where the data becomes so important as in real time as we are going to do that. So it is not yet there, but there. But I want to clarify one point on G20 proposition and others on the debt. Let us not confuse between debt write-off with debt suspension. There is a debt suspension, which does not mean that you don't pay, you just pay later. And so the debt overhang continues. But there is, till now, there had been no universal debt relief, debt exemption award as of today, not even from G20. So we are looking forward to that where that compensatory finance, that is another form, when the debt relief will come instead of debt suspension. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, so who will answer the question from Mustafiz Bhai, the interest rate of concessional and non-concessional loans? So Sachin, over to you now.
Sachin is a lender too now.
Thanks, Dr. Fahmida. I think the debt suspension and debt cancellation. Good that Debuda has drawn this distinction, and G20 all through has been talking about DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. So it is definitely an initiative which is for debt service suspension, under which the liquidity support was provided immediately for $14 billion, but ultimate aim is to benefit 53 countries, and the whole idea is to provide support of $274 billion. And out of 53, according to a recent report in Financial Times, 48 countries have already declared themselves as troubled. And as we are seeing, China hasn't agreed, but other countries have come around, those who are part of the Paris governance principles, and they are going to go forward. So I think at this stage for global economy to adjust, the discussion is more about debt service suspension, and G20 is working under the Saudi leadership in that direction. The Italian presidency has also indicated continuation and working towards this. When India takes up in 2022 the G20 presidency, India would have to see, and that would be the year when recovery phase would be out of the quagmire of several sort of projections, and realization would be very much on the table. So I see that dimension very clearly. To Dr. Mozem's question, I think the issue is not so much about GPDC versus Southern principles, which is, I think we can discuss at some other point, but definitely the idea of development compact, in which the in-kind support from the South to the Southern economies, the currency swap arrangements, the volatility of currencies to be absorbed at some level. And that's why my first point today was to create the global public goods. I did talk about the multilateralism that supports creation of global public goods, not only for access to medicine and create a delicate balance between incentivizing the private firms to do research and also the public policy objective of access to medicine. How do we arrive at that? So you require global funds to come up with. When I was at Yale University, we had worked with Thomas Pogge on the Health Impact Fund. So like that, we require global funds to come up, which probably may fall under the OECD category of vertical funds. So I think we require those kind of initiatives, and that's where it is possible. The sustenance of Southern principles, Dr. Mozem, is so high that I'm very sure that OECD and GPDC, for that matter, would absorb the Southern principles rather than the other way around. Yep. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to request Dr. Abid Suleri, if you have any comments to make at this point.
Yes, I think one thing that needs to be emphasized, that the role of multilateral institutions in recovery from COVID needs to be continued, because COVID is not over. One of the UNESCAP model, it tells us that if Pakistan has to take its spending, fiscal stimulus as well as social protection to 7% of GDP in 2021, we would require at least $11 billion. Now, keeping in view the low FDI, and keeping in view that Pakistan has been historically one of the lowest recipient of foreign aid for last 10 years. If you look at the data for South Asia for last 10 years, Sri Lanka and Pakistan, they are one of the lowest recipient of foreign aid. So that's where we do require cooperation and collaboration from multilateral institutes. Another thing that needs to be kept in mind that any fiscal stimulus or any social protection that can't be stopped abruptly. We will have to phase out in a gradual manner. And in order to do that phasing out again, we need to do some sort of simulation, some sort of modeling, and try to see that from where those funds would be managed. And finally, I would say that the role of monetary policies domestically, I think that would also be very crucial and very vital, because the effectiveness of any loan, any grant, any foreign aid, that would be determined by the effective monetary policy. And in case of Pakistan, I can foresee 100 basic point raise. Right now it's 7.5% KIBOR, the interest rate, but I can foresee 100 basic point raise this year and 125 or 150 basic point raise next year, because of IMF conditionalities and because of curbing inflation. So if that happens, perhaps we would be losing out through increasing interest rate, what we would be trying to provide through fiscal stimulus or through social protection. So I think that's where perhaps multilateral institutions, they have to put their weight so that we can have some sort of compensatory monetary policy for keep on providing the response to COVID.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dushni, would you like to make final comments? Anything?
Just very quickly, Hamida, I think on the question that Mr. Peace raised about the interest rate at which we can raise foreign loans, I think there is no fixed rate. I mean, if you look at Sri Lanka's experience, because of the economic fallout, sovereign rating, downgrades, etc., bonds are now trading at something above 40% of the coupon rates. So, you know, when you are exposed to commercial debt and you have a sudden economic shock like COVID hitting, I think that leaves countries very highly exposed to volatilities in international capital markets. And a second point, very briefly, on debt relief. Again, I think the story is very different when a country's debt profile is not dependent on multilateral funding agencies, but your exposure is to international capital markets, because you cannot default on settlement of an international sovereign bond, or you cannot easily negotiate with private hedge fund investors, etc., who have bought your bonds. That would immediately go against your as a defaulter, and you really run into huge amounts of trouble. So I think going forward for South Asia as a region, these are lessons to be learned from the Sri Lankan experience that will be very relevant to countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, etc., as they also start dipping their toes into international capital markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dushni. Pushpa has left. So now I would like to request our a special guest here, special comments to be made by none other than Dr. A.B. Mirza Azizul Islam. We couldn't have a better person to make special comments. He was the former advisor to the caretaker government, Ministry of Finance and Planning. And he was also earlier Director Development Research and Policy Analysis Division of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP, Bangkok. He was also the Chairman, Securities and Exchange Commission, Bangladesh, and also Chairman, Board of Directors of Sonali Bank, which is one of the largest state-owned banks in Bangladesh. Currently, he is a professor at BRAC University, Bangladesh. So he is very much, well suited for making special comments and make his special insights, present his special insights on the topic which we are dealing with today. So over to you, sir, Dr. Mirza A.B. Mirza Azizul Islam.
Thank you, Hamida. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Apparently, my video has been stopped and I cannot restore it. But anyhow, well, hello?
Hello, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. You can go ahead, sir. Yes, yeah, your video has come back. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I appreciate the invitation by CPD and OECD to participate in this discussion, which has already been wide-ranging. Many issues have been covered. And Hamida, in your introduction about me, you might have raised expectations from the participants, which I'm confident I will not be able to fulfill. But anyhow, let me make a few quick comments. I have 5 minutes. I'll try to finish in 5.5 minutes. Okay. Now, there was a mention in the OECD paper that there has been a rise of international development finance. There has been an increase in the international development finance. Now, in this context, let me mention that 0.7% of gross national income of developed countries was agreed upon as far back as in 1980 as a part of the United Nations development decade. Now, that target has not yet been reached. Similarly, there was a target for Ldcs of 0.15% of GNI of the developed countries, so that has not been fulfilled either. So there is, I think, no scope for sort of complacence about the need for increasing global development finance, no matter whether there has been some rise in recent times or not. Now, the discussion here has been mostly from the point of view of the role of the donors or the development partners, as we call them these days. Now, I'd like to focus on certain aspects of the donors, but also certain issues relating to the recipient countries. Firstly, there has been no mention about conditionalities usually associated with development assistance. Now, sometimes these conditionalities are good, and they are good in the sense that the policymakers can make use of them in pursuing certain reforms which, left to themselves, they would not be able to pursue. They can tell the electorate that, look, this is something which the World Bank or the IMF or the ADB needs, and if we don't fulfill, we will be deprived of assistance, the country will suffer, and so from that perspective, it's sort of, it can be good. But on the other hand, sometimes these conditionalities do not make much sense. I have had some experiences with that. Now, I did, fortunately, negotiate with the relevant donors, and eventually I was able to get through whatever I wanted to, but that's not always very easy. So that's one issue that I think one needs to point out. Then there is a question of the authority exercised by the country offices of various donors and the need for clearance from headquarters. And now these often create procedural complexities, and so if you need to think about any change in the funding conditions or in the scope of work, etc., it becomes quite problematic. So here again, I think a lot has been talked about more delegation of authority to the country offices, but so far, to the best of my knowledge, nothing much has happened. Now, there is also a question of the relative usefulness of project-tied assistance versus budget support. Now, of course, COVID-19 has brought about some significant increase in budget support, but at least in Bangladesh, budget support has been falling for a long time, and most of the aid until recently has been in the form of project assistance. And the other aspect here is the question of the terms of finance. Now here, again, Bangladesh has been, or the grant element in Bangladesh, or rather grant as such, for Bangladesh has been falling for many, many years. Then, of course, it was receiving mainly concessional loan, but as has been already indicated by some of the speakers, now the country is confronted with being categorized as what is called blended, which means that part you receive from the Asian Development Fund or the IDA in the form of concessional loans, but you also receive a part on the basis of sort of non-concessional loans, though it may be somewhat lower than the market rate of interest. So that in turn is likely to create increase the debt servicing liability. Now, having said that, I need to mention a few things about the need for enhancing domestic capacity in various areas. Just funding is important, but that's not enough. Now, I have seen that the bureaucracy is not particularly adept in identification of needs of the country in various sectors. So what happens that the projects are actually chosen by the donors or the development partners rather than the home country agencies or institutions. And while some of them are good, but they are not always necessarily in consonance with the country's best interest. Secondly, there is also a considerable lack of negotiating capacity of the administrative machinery. And as a result, as I had already mentioned, certain conditionalities may be imposed which are not desirable, which are not necessary. And that's partly because the bureaucracy, which is not capable of carrying out effective negotiation with the development partners. Then, say you identify a project, you negotiate fund, you start using them, but there isn't very effective monitoring of use and evaluation of the impact. So that's something which is, again, I believe, pretty important. So these are some of the comments about the development finance and ODA or I have. I would like to end with just one or two other points. The question or the issue of foreign direct investment came up in the discussions. Now, for most of the poorer developing countries, including Bangladesh, foreign direct investment cannot be relied upon very much. Specifically for Bangladesh, as you know, that Bangladesh, in terms of proportion of GDP, is the lowest recipient of foreign direct investment among all the Asian countries. Now, some of the countries have done relatively better, but still not up to a satisfactory level. Now, here it is important. Well, first of all, I have been in the United Nations Center on Transnational Corporations for quite a few years, and had the opportunity to conduct a lot of research on the determinants of foreign direct investment. And one conclusion that has emerged from my research is that foreign investors go to country where the local private investors are investing. And from that perspective, Bangladesh is in a dire situation because our private investment as a proportion of GDP has remained in the range of 22-23% over the last 1 decade. And here it is important that we try to improve the ease of doing business. We try to improve our performance and governance indicators. So without that, there won't be any larger scale additional inflow of foreign direct investment. There will be a lot of talks, a lot of discussions, a lot of visits, but on the ground, not much happens. Finally, I would like to end with remittance. Here again, Bangladesh is a substantial recipient of remittance by our workers employed in different countries of the world. But then per capita remittance in Bangladesh is lower than all other major remittance receiving countries. That is Sri Lanka.
There is a technical problem.
Yeah, I think you better carry on.
Yes. Okay, Obru, you might call Mr. Azizul Islam. Meanwhile, we would like to carry on. We have now a video message from the Secretary General of OECD, Mr. Angel Gurria. So we'll play that video message. Meanwhile, we'll contact Dr. Mirza Azizul Islam to whether he will be able to make his finishing comments.
Zakir Bhai from Shamokal raised his hand.
Okay, Zakir, okay, you have any question to ask to the
panelists? I have a question. Okay. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, okay, Zakir.
I have a question to Mr. Devopriyo. Dr. Devopriyo, you know, so far we know that Bangladesh did not apply for the OECD debt deferment advantage. We know that Bangladesh so far did not apply. Is that a right approach now? My second question, do you suggest that multilateral donors or bilateral donors should take some measures for debt cancellation for Ldcs like Bangladesh?
Shall we listen to the video or we will discuss this issue? Or do we?
So first you can show the videos.
Let us first show the video and then, Zakir, I will come back to your issue.
Yeah.
Famida? Here.
We have lost her.
So you don't you show the video? No?
Yes, sir. I'm showing the videos.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am happy to launch OECD's Multilateral Development Finance 2020 report. As we face the most profound global health, economic, and social emergency in the history of the multilateral system, this report highlights the importance of restoring trust. Trust among nations, trust among people, trust in the governments and the institutions that people look to defend their rights, to protect them in the face of the pandemic and its dire economic and social consequences. Trust in multilateralism in the post-COVID world. Development finance is paramount in helping us achieve a fairer and more resilient recovery. Important progress has been achieved. For example, a large part of the financing made immediately available to developing countries at the beginning of the pandemic was channeled through the multilateral system. Multilateral organizations provided nearly $250 billion in immediate relief assistance, compared to $5.5 billion by bilateral donors. The report also shows that multilateral organizations can generate greater economies of scale, have a better presence in fragile contexts, and tend to work more closely with partner governments than bilateral donors. Nevertheless, numerous challenges exist, which are being compounded by the COVID-19 crisis. While the absolute volume of funding for multilateral organizations is growing, actually, core funding is declining. Between 2000 and 2018, the share of earmarked contributions in total multilateral funding rose by 29 percentage points, from 6 to 35%. In consequence, we are increasingly moving towards a system where ad hoc alliances between a handful of member countries determine the multilateral agenda. Now, several organizations display a high funding vulnerability with a highly concentrated donor base. Looking ahead, we need a multilateral system that brings governments together around hard facts, equipped with the right tools and expertise, and with a shared resolve to move forward and keep the 2030 agenda alive and within reach. Our latest Multilateral Development Finance report puts forward a number of recommendations focusing on tackling these challenges and helping us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Now, let me briefly highlight 3 of these recommendations. First, use the momentum generated by the COVID-19 crisis to increase DAC members' level of official development assistance, including their financial contributions to multilateral organizations. Second, ensure that financial contributions to multilateral organizations provide them with sufficient independence and flexibility. And last but not least, enhance accountability in order to restore trust in the multilateral development system. Now, this will require better communication of its results and of its impacts, as well as ensuring a transparent and effective division of labor. So, ladies and gentlemen, development finance is paramount for our global efforts to keep development on the right track, to keep countries that now need your support more than ever before. So be generous, be smart. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen.
That was Mr. Angela Gurria, Secretary General OECD. Before the video message, Dr. Abi Mirza Azizul Islam was speaking, he called me that he was talking from his mobile phone and the charge has died. So he had last 1 or 2 points he just communicated through me. He was talking about per capita remittance in Bangladesh, which is one of the lowest, and and therefore he recommended that we need to diversify the markets where we can send more people to work. And in order to diversify markets and in order to send more people to other markets, we have to upscale and we have to increase the skills of the workers. So that were his final comments, and he thanked everyone for inviting him and for listening to him. Now we have come to the end of our program. So we have our chairman, Professor Rehman Subhan, chairperson, CPD's founding chair of Center for Policy Dialogue. I would like to request our chairman to make his final comments.
You better answer the Shamakal question quickly.
Oh, okay. I wasn't.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yes, please.
I thought I was excused. Zakir, for your question, thank you. You see, given the current performance indicators of Bangladesh, that we never failed in servicing our debt, and that our debt stock is quite low till now, 1/3 of the GDP, which is much lower than many other low-income countries and middle-income countries. I don't think Bangladesh is either eligible or desiring to be considered as a part of a mercy case or a highly debted in-country category. It is not interested to be in. And possibly what is important, but however, if there is a global suspension or a global write-off, Bangladesh will be happy to take advantage of that. But there is also another category. Somebody asked me, the colleague asked me, Sohail from Daily Star, that what is a compensatory finance mechanism? This is precisely another compensatory finance mechanism which is exercised by the Japanese, that you pay up the debt and then you keep it in an account and then they return the money to you as a compensatory, they call it compensatory fund. And that may be earmarked for environmental purposes or something like that, but they exactly call it compensatory financing mechanism, that you pay it up and they return it back to you. To keep up the debt servicing regular, may keep it the habit, but at the same time reallocating to the countries, a recipient country in that way. So I think Bangladesh does not fall at this moment, thankfully, in that category when it needs a debt write-off as a country. But it can take advantage of it if there is a global decision on that, or there are country-specific arrangement with specific bilateral or multilateral arrangements. That would be my response. Thank you. I hope we will continue, Zakir, elsewhere. Thank you.
Okay, sir. So please.
My South Asian colleagues still here?
I don't see. Probably. Yes, Sachin is there. I can see Professor Sachin.
Sir, we are very much waiting for your address.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
We are very much waiting for your address.
And
Yes.
OCD colleagues are also here, I take it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll in fact round this up very quickly. I was greatly educated by the report. In fact, I did manage to read all of it. And I want to take off from the point where the Director General made his remarks, because this really didn't come up for discussion to any great extent. And that was the changing structure of ODA. In fact, the point which was made by the Director General now is that the larger part of ODA is still coming from bilateral donors, number one. And number two, there's been a rising emphasis on what they in fact call the dedicated funds, which are in fact actually assigned by the bilateral donors to the multilateral for in fact spending on particular projects. So this actually means that the multilaterals in the numbers that were used in this report In fact, only about account for 25% of ODA, which is under their full and exclusive control. This essentially means that you have now a global development finance architecture, which is in fact increasingly under the control of bilateral donors who use it both at the bilateral level and also in terms of the way they pledge their money to the multilateral institutions in order to exercise their own preferences. Part of this is politically determined because there is an increasing tendency to politicize the way in which the ODA resources are committed, as was historically the case, but perhaps in the case of some countries, even more so. And secondly, in terms of determining their own notions of global priorities as to where they want funds to go and how they want multilateral institutions to actually invest those funds. So the lament of the Director General at his conclusion that he would like to have greater emphasis on multilateralism as a post-COVID situation is of course still a pious hope, because the trends leading up to the COVID crisis around which the data in this report was actually presented indicated that we are moving into a world of, in fact, verticalization, not just in terms of projects and agendas, but also in sources of finance. The second issue, which in fact was mentioned in the report, but in fact is a significant omission in this day and age, is that there are now other sources of multilateral financing, but not necessarily coming through what would be categorized as multilateral financial institutions. The report, of course, mentions the BRIC initiative, the NDF, and of course the Asian Infrastructure Bank. I mean, the Asian Infrastructure Bank is capitalized at $100 billion, the other at $50 billion. But much bigger than that, and a much bigger resource flow, which is very relevant to at least 4 out of the 5 members of South Asia who are assembled over here, is what in fact the report actually calls official other financial flows, which is another name for the way in which China in particular is channelizing loan financing to this part of the world, mostly dedicated to infrastructure financing. But of course, they have also now come in and are playing a role in helping finance COVID. But mostly it is coming in the form of loans on various terms to, in fact, actually contribute to what would be categorized as development financing and would be categorized as a form of ODA, though not measured in the old ways. Now, anyone who wants to write about multilateral financing today will need to take this account, all this into account, particularly for South Asia, because this has now become a major factor over here, and will then also need to relate this to the other main source of financing which has been coming in, particularly for a country like India, FDI. And finally, in relation to what Mirza Aziz Sam mentioned, which was in fact actually remittances, which is in fact actually the main source of external financing coming into Bangladesh, where we have all universally failed to in fact actually create the necessary financial instruments and institutional arrangements to see that a significant component of this is in fact converted into investment resources rather than into exclusively a source of consumption financing. So any major discussion in the South Asian context, where in all our cases, we have become significantly less dependent on ODA. After all, even Nepal is down to 4%, but virtually the other 3 of us over here, and India included, are in the range of 1 and 2%, you have got a whole range of other sources of financing coming in. So the way in which you, in fact, actually look at multilateral financing is, of course, in a very different light from what you used to see it in the 6days, 7days, and 8days. Now, the concluding point I wish to make over here is that one of the big problems which was identified but not adequately addressed is that this peculiar verticalization and tied form of bilateral aid flows has, of course, meant that there's a virtual, you may say, incoherence, if not outright chaos, in the world of ODA financing, in which various people donors are indulging themselves according to their own likes and prejudices and preferences. And so a country which is at the receiving end has to essentially deal with all these different sources and adjust to these different types of finances and preferences coming in on different terms. The only solution I can identify to this, which is in theory what we were supposed to be doing in the first place, and which was what was the original inspiration for ODA, was that we were supposed to all have working development plans where we set our own priorities and retained control over both our policies as well as our development priorities and could manage these resources effectively. If we could, in fact, actually then have our own managed consortiums owned by the countries of South Asia, and we are now presumably at a better level to do so than we used to be, then you would be identifying the type of funds you need from which category of donors, and you would be utilizing your funds in those ways. If you were, for instance, assigning the fact that virtually all our need for infrastructure financing would come exclusively from countries like China using their official flows, or would come from the now non-concessional sources of the multilateral financial institutions, we would in fact know what was coming in on what terms. And we would be seeking then from other donors, getting a better idea of where their preferences are and the terms they are to finance other programs where we need it. In the case of Bangladesh, we have become actually now quite indifferent to the effective utilization of aid. In fact, actually, for a country which in fact seeks multilateral finance, if you in fact look, the big overhang for Bangladesh is not actually over debt. It is over, in fact, the lack of utilization of ODA, which is in fact the overhang over here. And in fact, if we were serious about the effective utilization of this, we would have prioritized this and made effective use, but we don't actually do that. So the major agenda, which I would say, at least for the South Asian countries, I would leave with you is, one, you must get both your policy-making agenda in shape. You must be more serious about implementing policy. You must have your institutions for implementing development much more effective and in control of their things. You must be better positioned to dictate to the different external funders what you want. And this includes the FDI flows coming in. And finally, you must make much better use of your major source of external finance, which in fact happens to be multilateral, the funding coming in from the remittance flows, which in fact has been our major asset. And we have in fact completely failed to make effective use of it, apart from in fact showing that we have got enhancement in our foreign exchange reserves. These are the thoughts I leave with you, but are grateful to the OECD. And I would perhaps suggest to you that the next time you prepare a report, kindly take into account all the major sources of external resource flows coming in. And keep in mind that in China in particular, it isn't just Asia Infrastructure Fund, and it isn't just the NDF, but they have a whole range of banks, which in fact have invested in the range of over something like $300 billion in various forms of blended finance. And to in fact actually write this off as a different part of the ball game is, I think, a big error in understanding, particularly for South Asia, what are the ways in which we are going to access resources and how we will use them. Okay, thank you very much, CPD and OECD, for getting us all together. And I'm grateful that at least South Asians are coming together to collectively look at this. And perhaps the issues that I've raised on the table may be made into a major issue for discussion by us collectively at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your remarks, very important ones. And I think we have all have to take lessons from that and from your insights. Lastly, I would like to conclude by thanking everyone from the OECD and CPD. OECD, I can see, so of course, Olivier is there, and June and Fabregas. Thank you all for making this event a success. And also my CPD colleagues, Obro, Sarwar, Ittiza, and the whole dialogue division have been working on this program, and we have successfully completed that. And also to all the panelists, the keynote presenters, and the participants for joining this this afternoon. With this, I would like to thank and stay well, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.